Gracias por seguir con nosotros. Continuamos esta charla con Michael Schmidt. Michael, we know you're working right now for an organization called Fry Intermedia. Can you explain us what Fry Intermedia does?
Fry Intermedia is a small journalism training agency. We're based in Johannesburg. We operate across the African continent, and now, glad to know, in Mexico as well. So we're spreading our wings. We're all journalists. If you take our management component, collectively we've got more than 90 years experience in the field, and this includes working in North Korea, in Afghanistan, and some really, really interesting parts of the world. So we've got a really experienced core team.
When you say interesting, you mean special, maybe violent situations?
Well, indeed, yes. North Korea, obviously a very hermetically sealed society, very unusual, almost trapped in amber, and stuck in the 1950s in some ways. One of the last surviving Stalinist states. So yeah, we've certainly worked collectively in some very dramatic areas. But what we do nowadays is we look across the continent, and we partner with people who are experts in various fields or media specialists, and we make direct interventions in newsrooms. We go and do training in newsrooms where we know there's a specific need. For instance, we've worked in several African countries, including Mali, Zambia, and Uganda, where we know there's the country's economy is driven by the agricultural component, and women's work in that in producing that agricultural wealth is significant, and yet very few people in the mainstream media are in fact covering that contribution and really trying to interrogate women's role within the rural economy. So we've made interventions like that. We do interventions in terms of actual conflict reporting. We've started the first conflict reporting masterclass in South Africa, which, given our violent and troubled history, and given the fact that so many South African journalists have really made a name for themselves as conflict reporters, is quite remarkable that there hasn't been training in this field. We train journalists, we bring them together with scientists to encourage them to report accurately and in depth on scientific matters. It's a very wide range. We look at elections and truth and justice issues. It's very broad.
Now that you're mentioning all these issues, there's an international debate about the responsibility of the media in reporting these kind of conflicts, because sometimes the role that they play can actually work in the prejudice of a conflict. Sometimes it's the media who help igniting a situation. And we've seen examples like Rwanda, what happened in the genocide in '94. How can you train reporters, or how can you pass that responsibility of a journalist that has to be true to the profession, but at the same time remain neutral enough to be able to transmit that information without contributing to the conflict?
It's a crucial issue that you've raised, and some people that I work with have made some interesting interventions here. In Lebanon, for instance, Hezbollah has its own party TV station called Al Manar, which is an unabashed propaganda station. It's actually quite shocking or amusing to watch, because it's completely unfettered. This unadulterated pornography of violence. And interventions have been made to bring together journalists from both sides of the political divide, to train them in Lebanon on the ethics of reporting. And one of the most interesting projects has actually seen a TV journalist from Al Manar working alongside a TV journalist from one of the opposition stations to together produce a program that would go out on both stations. So I think that's kind of making progress. You mentioned Rwanda. There we obviously saw radio stations in particular, and some of the partisan newspapers actually promoting the genocide, and Radio Thousand Hills, as it's called in English, Radio Mille Collines, calling for the genocide to accelerate. In fact, saying that the grave is half full. Who will help us fill it? these reporters, several reporters who were involved in that station, have now justifiably been brought to justice. They are facing international human rights violations charges at The Hague and in other forums as well, at the Arusha War Crimes Tribunal, etc. So yeah, it's really important that journalists, regardless of their own personal politics, do not act in a partisan way and do not stoke the flames of resentment. We saw it in South Africa last year. A lot of fingers have been pointed at one of our large tabloids, Daily Sun, which was accused of essentially endorsing the chasing of foreigners out of South Africa. We had 62 people murdered, millions of rands damage caused, and about 100,000 people displaced. So it had a dramatic effect and impact on our country. And the media had a partial responsibility for that.
Right now, when you're talking about this issue, for example, with this newspaper, the Daily Sun, and the fact that they were pointed that they were endorsing this kind of situation, doesn't that go against the freedom, the right to freedom of speech that the media calls for? And what is that thin line where media can actually represent that freedom of speech, but at the same time don't be responsible for contributing to a conflict?
In some ways, to be honest, Cecile, we have less freedom of speech in South Africa than in some of the other parts of the world. We have less freedom of speech than in the United States, for instance. We have a less free media than in Mali, in the Sahel, who have just come out of a dictatorship and have really embraced democracy in a fabulous way. Everybody and his dog is starting up a radio station or a satirical newspaper, etc. In South Africa, precisely because of the conflicts of our past and the racial conflicts of our past, it is felt that the media needs to be restrained to a degree, certainly in terms of its ethical behavior. So we operate under restrictions in terms of what one can say about people in terms of their gender or their ability or their race in particular. And I think this is usually justified because we really don't want to recreate the sort of monstrously partisan and racist media of the past. But at the same time, it's not the responsibility, I believe, of the authorities to police journalists. It's the responsibility of journalists themselves to be ethical. I don't think there's any conflict of interest between freedom of the press and journalists operating ethically within their societies. I think the two are intimately connected.
And when you're mentioning this connection between the journalists and the government, the reality right now in South Africa is that they're working together, or are the journalists actually pacing themselves?
We do have a problem with some journalists who are very much on board the government's bandwagon, which is quite right. I mean, I believe that journalists can or should be allowed to be politically active. There is some school of thought in the United States and other countries that journalists shouldn't even vote, that they shouldn't be part of political processes whatsoever. I think that's being unreasonable. Journalists are human beings too. Yes, we have our prejudices, etc. We have our own beliefs. One might be an atheist or a Catholic or whatever. I think it's important to recognize that we're human beings and that we engage as human beings and to bring our humanity to our work. But at the same time, when we go into work, we need to be able to put aside our personal prejudices and our own partisanship. And really, it's a basic legal principle and it's a basic journalistic principle, which is hear the other side. And really hear it in a fair way. Hear it with open ears. Judiciously balance things out and try and seek the truth. Journalism without the truth is meaningless.
It's very interesting, your position, Michael. We'll be right back. Just take a few minutes. Regresamos en un momento en su programa panorámico del Tecnológico de Monterrey.